We just talked about what is the objective of consolidation and what may complicate the consolidation process. And we also mentioned that one of the complication here is the parent may choose to use different methods to monitor its relationship with the subsidiary. So specifically, let's look at the methods the parent can use. The parent can use either of the three methods. So going forward, after the day subsequent to the date of acquisition, the parent may choose to use either of the three methods: the equity method, the initial value method, and the partial equity method. Let's first look at the equity method. Under the equity method, so we have 5 events here. The equity method, it is very similar to the equity method that we talked about when the parent has between 20% to 50% ownership of the subsidiary. It is very similar to that one. Specifically, if you still remember what we did under the equity method in chapter 1, when subsidiary earns and report income, what is it? What is the journal entry? So when subsidiary earns and report income, the journal entry recorded by the parent is to debit investment, credit equity in subsidiary income. And then when subsidiary declares dividend, the journal entry made by the parent is to debit dividend receivable, credit investment account. So it is viewed as a decrease in the parent's investment account. When the parent receives dividend, so journal entry debit cash because they received cash, credit dividend receivable because it is no longer a receivable for the parent. Recognize amortization and allocation. So this is the amortization of excess payment. And then the journal entry is to debit equity in subsidiary earnings, credit investment account. So which is exactly opposite to the first one. Intra-entity transactions defer unrealized gains. So this is debit equity in subsidiary earnings, credit investment account. It is also just the opposite as the first one. So this is under the equity method, how would the journal entries the parent makes. And then the second method the parent can use to monitor its relationship with the subsidiary is called the initial value method. And this method is very similar to the fair value method we talked about before, which is basically when the parent has less than 20% ownership of the subsidiary. And then the journal entry, if you still remember what we do under the fair value method. So you will, this will kind of remind you what we should do here. Under the initial value method, when subsidiary earns and reports income, the parent does not do anything. When subsidiary declares dividend, the parent's journal entry is to debit dividend receivable, credit dividend income. So this is viewed as an income for the parent. When parent receives dividend from the subsidiary, the parent's journal entry is to debit cash, credit dividend receivable. And there's no need to record for the amortization of excess payment or intra-entity transaction under the initial value method. So this is the second method the parent can use to monitor its relationship with the sub. And then the last method the parent can choose to monitor its relationship with the sub is called partial equity method. And this method is kind of in between the equity method and the initial value method. So this is a method that is somehow in between those two methods. What do we do under this method? When subsidiary earns and reports income, the parent's journal entry is to debit investment account, credit equity in subsidiary earnings. So this is exactly the same as what we do under the equity method. When subsidiary declares dividend, the parent's journal entry is to debit dividend receivable, credit investment. So again, this is exactly the same as what we do under the equity method. When parent receives dividend from the subsidiary, the journal entry is to debit cash, credit dividend receivable. So again, this is exactly the same as what we do under the equity method. But as for the allocation of excess payment and intra-entity transaction, the parents do not do anything under those two situations. So under these two situations, what the parents do is very similar as what it would do under the initial value method. So that's why we say that the partial equity method is kind of in between. For the first three journal entries, it follows the equity method, and for the last two, it is the same as what we do under the initial value method. So just to do a brief comparison of the three methods, assuming there's no intra-entity transaction, we're going to talk about the situation when there is intra-entity transaction later. But now let's just assume there's no intra-entity transaction. I want you to take 5 minutes, try to figure out how is the investment account affected by each of the method. So what would be your investment account balance under the equity method, under the initial value method, and under the partial equity method? Please take 5 minutes, try to work it out on your own. Please pause your video for now. So the investment account balance under the equity method, if like this equation is a lot hard to figure out. You just pull out all of the journal entries we just talked about 1 minute ago. So the investment account balance, it is increased by initial investment. It is also increased by all of the subsequent income by the subsidiary. Because whenever subsidiary reports an income, the parent will debit investment account, right? So that's why investment account will be increased by all of the subsequent income by the subsidiary, and it will be decreased by all of the subsequent dividend by the subsidiary. Because whenever subsidiary reports a dividend, the parent's journal entry is to decrease the investment account and to increase dividend receivable. And it will also be decreased by all of the subsequent amortization of excess payment, because the journal entry under this situation is to debit equity in subsidiary earnings credit investment account. So this is how the investment account will be affected by all of those events. And then how about the initial value method? Under the initial value method, the investment account would not be affected by all of the subsequent income or dividend by the subsidiary. So actually, the investment account would only be equal to the initial investment. So no matter the subsidiary earns income, declares dividend, there's any excess amortization, none of those is going to affect the investment account. And then under the partial equity method, it is very similar to the equity method. The only difference here is there's no amortization. So amortization does not affect the investment account under the parent's investment account under the partial equity method. So this is a comparison of the three methods as for the investment account. And now I want you to do another comparison of the three methods for the income account. How were the income account affected by each method? Please take 5 minutes, try to work on it on your own. And please pause your video for now. So under the equity method, the investment account that is going to be affected is called equity in subsidiary earnings, and it will be increased by the current period income by the subsidiary. So whenever subsidiary reports income, we are going to debit equity in subsidiary earnings, and it is going to be decreased by the current period amortization of excess payment. Whenever we are doing amortization of excess payment, the journal entry is to decrease, is to credit is to decrease the equity in subsidiary earnings, or in other words, because earnings is the balance should be at the credit side. So in order to decrease it, we're debiting equity in subsidiary earnings and we're crediting the investment account. So this is equity. This is for the equity method, and for the initial value method, we don't have equity in subsidiary earnings. Instead, we're having the dividend income, and the dividend income will be increased by the current period dividend by the subsidiary. As for the partial equity method, so it is very similar to the first one, except that we don't have amortization here. So amortization wouldn't affect the earnings of the parent under the partial equity method. So this is a comparison of the three methods as for its effect on the income account. And now let's go over an example so that we're going to have a better idea how three methods differs here and their respective impact on different accounts.